All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Hannah Yelin. I'm an associate professor in media and culture, and I'm the chair of the Creative Industries Network. And here we are at the end of day two of our fabulous sixth International Creative Industries Festival. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this, what we're calling Celebrity Culture Club conversation on navigating Hollywood's creative machine. Now, this is the last of our online events as part of the festival, but the festival continues for the rest of the week on our Oxford-based campus. So if you're in the area, please come to as many events as you can. And now today we have the incredible opportunity to hear from Etan Marciano, a Hollywood screenwriter whose credits include Girlfriend's Guide to Divorce, DIETLAND, CITADEL, and Swarm, and many others that Etan will tell us about. Etan also served as the mythology coordinator, AGBO, the Russo Brothers production company, which is the coolest job title in the world ever. And we'll discuss in a minute what it actually means. So Etan today is going to take us behind the scenes of script writing and myth making and world building and storytelling, and all of those cool things and how they sit in today's entertainment ecosystems. So please join me in welcoming Etan Marciano for what promises to be a really fascinating and insightful conversation. Hello, Etan.
Hello, hello. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Hannah.
Absolutely our pleasure. I should say a couple of housekeeping things, which is that I'm going to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions at the end. So everybody, please post your questions in the chat at any point as they occur to you, but I will keep time for them at the end and I will respond to everything that's in the chat at the end of this session. And also my colleagues are going to post some feedback forms in the chat later, and it's really helpful to the organising team if audience members can fill those out. And I should also say thank you to the audience for coming. It's really great to see so many of you here, especially when it's the first beautiful spring day that we've had here so far this year. All right, let's start. Eitan, we've called this talk Navigating Hollywood's Creative Machine. Is it that? Is it a difficult to navigate machine?
This is the understatement of the century. Yes, I would say quite difficult. Let's see. I guess for myself personally, being in this business now for scary to think, but maybe close to 15 years and just how much it's changed since then. Yeah, it's always been quite a machine. And if you think back around, a decade and a half ago, there was a lot more of a structure, I would say, a predictable structure in place, which is something that we kind of maybe are not privy to or don't think too much about as just audience members and consumers of TV and film and other, well, now there's so much more. Now we have a thing that we even just call content. I think back when I started, we were just starting to scratch the surface of that concept even. But now, yes, navigating the machine is really, it's smarter to think of it as multiple machines competing with one another. It's not just some kind of unified apparatus where it's like, okay, I'm just going to get this entry level job and then work my way up, which was sort of the reigning concept of when I started. I was a teacher before I ever got into screenwriting, and I had no connections into this business, which is something I'm sure we all hear about, like kind of how, oh, so and so knows, so and then you sort of you're just magically involved in the business. It was something where I was like just completely in the dark on how any of it worked. This program started up out of a university in Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, and by this screenwriter, very well-known screenwriter who like co-wrote Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks and just had that kind of like old Hollywood pedigree. And even his version of starting was like something that it was unimaginable. He basically like tracked down Mel Brooks at a coffee shop called like Chock full of nuts or something or whatever this franchise was back in LA in the 70s, and he like gave him a spec script and was like, read my script, Mel Brooks. And he like harassed him every day until Mel was like, all right, get in touch with my assistant. And then lo and behold, Norman got hired and then had this storied career. And then, cut to where I started, and it was still kind of this concept, get your foot in the door and work your way up. And that was kind of the presiding belief for me, which is like, okay, I guess I'll just do what I need to do. And that involved for me, like starting out as an art department PA on a network show at the time called Person of Interest. I was literally about to like leave for Los Angeles, and then this opportunity came up to interview for this job, and I had no idea what the art department was or what they did. I was like, I'm a writer. What do I know about the art department? But I, of course, consulted the one person I knew, Norman. He said, you get your foot in the door and then you just figure it out. And I thought, all right, I kind of love the adventure. I love the risk of that. And that's what happened. I interviewed for that job. The art department coordinator, a very lovely woman who I'm still friends with today, but she was like, she basically hired me with the caveat that like we could fire you within the month because you have no idea what you're about to get into. And this is kind of it's a very like intense job that maybe like writers are not like so equipped to like handle, based on what your training is. I mean, she was kind of right. It was one of the, most intense jobs, especially as a 30-year-old PA, which is typically it's people who are just sort of graduating. Um, but all that to say, it was this phenomenal opportunity to learn about production from the ground up, make connections with real working crew in New York, which is, kind of an epicenter of production. Um, and then that was my, that's an hour's worth of me telling you a story, which I can go down. But, just to kind of give you a point of contrast, by today's standard, I would almost say I kind of don't know how you get into this business. There's no
Mm.
clear-cut way of navigating this machine. Now it's as we all kind of know, because I'm sure you and the folks that are here are fairly media savvy and reading articles all the time and kind of have an ear to the ground. I mean, it's now we're in a kind of creator economy space where if you want to be a writer or a director or a producer, it's so much about you just kind of going out and doing it. And the navigation starts there. There are still opportunities maybe to do what I did, but few and far between since COVID, when a lot of like writers' rooms have gone virtual. So those entry level positions at writers' room PA, much harder to come by. It's hard to get lunch when you're, staring at a screen all day. You can't really get lunch for those folks. But that was an instrumental way of kind of coming up for me, and I know for a lot of folks as well, kind of a certain age.
Mm.
So I hope that kind of addressed it, but it's a kind of it's the navigation of it now, and I would say a lot of people probably share this a sentiment is that there's no kind of one working paradigm anymore. Now it's a little bit of the Wild West and
Mm.
in an exciting but mostly daunting kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so definitely sounds like an increasingly unnavigable set of interlocking machines. So you've told us a little bit there about your path in, and that it was later, that you took these some deliberate decisions. Was screenwriting always the plan, or is it something that evolved organically once you had that first foot in the door?
Yeah, no, screenwriting was so far from the plan. I think, from high school through college in my 20s, I really fancied myself a kind of a classic, right? Prose. I was really intent on writing a novel, short stories. That was kind of my creative writing training from high school through my 20s. And that was where I was toiling. I had a day job working as a freelance museum educator at a bunch of different museums in New York, which was very exciting. Come from a family of teachers. I had no formal teacher training myself, but it was just something I kind of fell into and really enjoyed and kind of made a pseudo career out of it. But I would say every free moment I had was like, all right, I'm working on my stories. I'm working on this novel. But then sometime in my mid 20s, which was maybe like in the late, aughts, like maybe around 2010 or so, I had read an article in the New Yorker about these text novels that were really popular in Japan. And it was like utilizing just like kind of the web 2.0, if I'm using that correctly. But this idea that there were these authors who were literally like texting novels line by line, and they were aggregated into fuller novels, and they were like the best sellers in Japan at the time, romance. But still, and I thought that was just such an exciting concept, especially as at that time, it's scary to think, but that was the time YouTube was really coming out, and Twitter and Tumblr and all of these sort of social media companies were starting to launch. You could see then that people's attention was being taken away from what I thought the sacred novel, the short stories, and it just felt like it was pulling conversation away from there. And I thought it would be really exciting to try my hand at some version of that. Can I like come up with a concept that could dole out fiction on a daily basis so it wasn't overwhelming people, but they can kind of follow a story. And I ended up utilizing social media at the time so that you could follow the characters through their social media sort of thread, so to speak. And I worked with a web developer and we created a whole specified site for it, and it was very exciting. I self-published it. It was great. And then at that point, it was like a light bulb went off, and it was like, this feels like what I just did was like serialized storytelling in a way that I never fully conceived of. And it aligned with some shows at the time that were kind of coming out in a revolutionary way, like Mad Men and Breaking Bad, Downton Abbey, even, which is like, huge fan of that show. But they were just doing TV in a way that I had never seen before. And that was kind of the sort of incubation that eventually sparked this interest in screenwriting. And then it just so happened to align with this program that had started up by, Norman Steinberg, called the TV Writer Studio, which he was like, I'm going to teach you exactly how to write for TV and run a TV show and the production of it.
It's really nice for our students to hear about, making a decision, taking a course, and then that actually being a real kind of intervention in your life path. Now, I said earlier that you were a mythology coordinator. Now, that's not a common job title, is it? And it's not your current job title, I should say. So previously, you were mythology coordinator, maybe the only mythology coordinator ever. Do you want to start by explaining what that role was and how the best job title ever came about?
I guess. Yeah, no, it's a very unique job title, which, anytime anyone, met me and found out about that title, they were always kind of taken aback, in
I'm
a good
imagining
way.
a Patrick Bateman, business card moment where you just
I did,
win. You win every
yes.
time.
Yes, I was very excited to finally get that business card, if I could still find it. Yeah, it was something that kind of again happened organically in this very exciting way. I had been working on this show, an Amazon show called Citadel, which was a big world building enterprise. And in the wonderful way, this is just something to keep in mind. Again, speaking with students who might be interested in getting into this business, just how important showing up to work and really enjoying it, even when it's tough. And this is a tough business. That was a tough show. But I had a philosophy from that first art department PA kind of gig that I had, which is just sort of like, this is an exciting thing. Days are going to be tough, but in the long run, if you really believe in this is a very exciting place to be. Long-winded way to say maybe that I met the Russo brothers' sister. She's a wonderful woman, like truly was a mentor and a champion of mine. And she was a writer on Citadel for a brief period of time, and we connected. That show wrapped. Then a year and a half later, I hear from her out of the blue, and she was like, "Hey, would you like to come and work for us here at AGBO? We're up to some really exciting stuff, and you just might be interested in it." And I had sold a show at that point. I had worked on other shows, and it's that was just to offer some clarity. That was me going from a writer's room to working for a studio, not like a studio like a Fox or a Disney, but still like a studio. The brothers were just coming off of, arguably the two biggest movies of all time, with the Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame. But an independent studio, which had a lot of clout. And, it was very exciting. It was one of these things where they were like, hey, we're about to enter into multiple world building sort of enterprises,
And do
based
you
on the
want,
Marvel.
just for our audience to, just before you, I want to hear that anecdote very much, but also can you just tell us what's meant by world building enterprises? Like what's the difference when it's a big world building enterprise
Oh
versus
yeah,
other types
yeah,
of
of
projects,
course.
just for
I'll
terminology?
use Yeah, yeah, please, thank you. Like Marvel is such a great example of it because I think it's probably like the most premium version of it. But world building as Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, um, it could be from comic books to multiple novels and then translated onto screen. But world building in that you are going to have multiple expressions that kind of live within the same literal kind of world, kind of creative world. So Marvel's a great example of it in that, phase one of Marvel was like 20 odd movies. And that was just sort of the beginning of the world building enterprise. You had your core characters there, and in success of thinking about world building, then you have your TV spin-offs or there's elements of publishing involved or podcasts. I mean, this is kind of how Hollywood thinks about world building. It's centered on, core creative with a few key characters, but then in success, like how can we build out storylines that can exist not just in one medium, but in multiple media simultaneously, and even in more success, which is very hard to do, but like, can you make it really all work in a cohesive and meaningful way?
Great. And then you were about to tell us what a mythology coordinator would do
Yes.
within that.
Yeah, so I guess actually it's a great segue because if you're really thinking about it, you are juggling like, and this is probably the most boring way to think of creative, but it just was a way that I could frame it. You're like juggling like data points, like creative data points, into like hundreds, thousands, like you're just getting going. You're like, there was this character in that thing, or right, or this object in that. There's or Star Wars is another great example, of course, of world building enterprise, or Star Trek. These things that have lived with us for decades, characters that have lived with us for decades. You need to kind of track that and build that out and organize it. So in the way that mythology coordinator came to be, it was kind of like uh it's sort of I don't like entry level. I don't want to say entry level, but it's like it was like kind of it's like a path towards becoming a world builder yourself. So in the way that they kind of conceived of it was like, hey, we really need someone. We are working on four different world building IP, enterprises at the same time, while Joe and Anthony are, working on one movie here, and they're producing, in pre-production on one movie here, production on this, post-production on that. It just, behind the scenes, you're like, okay, we need someone who really is tracking every minor detail across each of these world building enterprises. Not tracking and then also in success, helping to actually like build out the creative. So a lot of it was really like kind of this management of the worlds themselves, if that. So it's like that, like, you had at the time it was the Gray Man, Extraction, Electric State. They were these various kind of things that they were just starting to get off the ground. So a lot of it was really helping them start to um, kind of concretize what the world building was, the sort of mythology of each world was. If you take Extraction, for example, like really understanding that world on a very granular level. Same thing with Gray Man or Electric State, and kind of anything else they had, in pre-production at the time.
Great. And what about now? I mean, I'm sure that there are things that you can't tell us about now when things are in development. That I understand that the things you can't, but can you just give us a sense, understanding that there'll be specific things that can't be discussed, but a general picture of what you can tell us about at the moment in terms of what you're doing?
Just like what I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting. I mean, I would love, and speaking about like navigating the Hollywood machine, right? There was such an epic, fertile period of time after, Joe and Anthony finished the Marvel movies and they were getting into world building. Like that was like a very cool moment where like world building like kind of was the rage. and the streamers and studios, they were all like very like, all right, we're in it. We want like kind of like the next Marvel. Like this is very exciting to us, and it still is. But there's, after the writer's strike and after these mergers, and it's like everyone, we see it. You don't have to be in Hollywood to kind of see just how kind of tectonic the grounds are shifting. It's all that to say is that world building is still this incredible thing, but it's for me, and what a priority is for me. It's like it's only so many people can accomplish like what the Russo brothers can, or James Cameron, or Steven Spielberg. It seems very reserved for kind of like certain group of well-established creators. So what I'm working on now are just kind of like, one-off features of, kind of the psychological thriller variety. It's like, which is kind of, where I really love to live is probably that space. But at the same time, because of the experience working on Citadel and with AGBO, I now have a whole other, version of myself as a writer where it's like, oh, I would love to get back to world building, and I have certain things that are kind of in the mix, that I would love to kind of develop out using a lot of like the kind of knowledge and tools from that period of time.
Great. So you've kind of preempted a couple of my questions there by bringing up this kind of elite group who get to do this thing that not everybody can. Something that's come up throughout all of the events so far is really the politics of representation. So we had a fabulous roundtable yesterday about trans visibility or in slash visibility in the creative industries, both in front of and behind the camera. Um, so I'm really interested in this from your perspective, where you're sitting. Like, how much creative freedom is there to reshape those representational politics of gender and race and class and so forth? And is that something that's up for grabs in the process? Or, like, at what point do those interventions happen, if they do, in terms of, identity, representation, and power?
Interesting. So let me see. I just want to make sure I have the question. I totally understand it. So it's just the ability for the creator to kind of intervene on the path of representation, or like,
Yeah, well, I suppose my next question is after this is also going to be about who is getting to tell those stories, and I guess there's a relationship between the two things, so we can talk about that from whichever angle is interesting
yeah, okay,
to
helpful.
you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the most incredible way from when I started in this business in like the area of like 2010 to where we are now. I mean, the business has just radically changed in terms of what studios are after. And the best possible way that has led to this kind of golden age of TV, what we call it. And that was, when there were 500 odd shows on TV, and there was just this, it was a boom town in the most incredible way. And part of that though was geared towards representation. So for the first time, for the first time ever in this incredible way, you were finally like having really like just the whole spectrum of any kind of writer having the chance to really like pitch out a great story with a kind of cultural identity specificity. It was never perfect, but it was probably the most successful attempt, I would say, at diversifying what we were seeing. Like, I think really ever. I mean, if you if you study film history or TV history, I mean, there are sort of watershed moments in both where you had representation, but it was really kind of in the past 15 years that we've just had this incredible opportunity to have, folks behind the camera and in front of the camera really like take charge of what narratives we're seeing. That said, I mean, it's still a business, and it's still a commercial enterprise. So there's good intentions, but then there's reality on the ground. And I think this goes back to that core question of navigating and managing expectations and dealing with setbacks and frustrations. We're still there. We're still in this sort of laboratory of kind of trying to figure out how this works. I have friends, across the sort of racial and ethnic sort of spectrum, and they're all everyone tracks a certain kind of lane because that's like kind of what it is. It's like what percentage of representation do we have on screen if you're dealing with um, the sort of Hispanic community versus the African American community versus the Jewish or Asian, in a wonderful way, everyone is much more aware of it, and fighting for it. But that's, unfortunately, it's, we haven't figured out, exactly how it works. And in that world of this business kind of collapsing and rebuilding itself, that is still very fertile ground for, I think a viable, kind of path forward.
Yeah, interesting. And also another thing you talked about there is something else that's come up in a lot of our talks so far this week, which is this tension between creativity and commercial pressure. Like everybody has at some point kind of approached this question. So can you talk a little more about how you have in your various iterations like experienced that and whether it varies depending on where you've been sitting? Because of course you've worked on absolutely ginormous projects with the hugest number of stakeholders, and also huge teams, right? So there's the collaboration dynamic as well as working on much smaller, more independent projects. So yeah, can you tell us about that tension between commerce and creativity and freedom in different types of roles?
Yeah, no, I would say that's probably one of the most relevant questions you can ask in this business today because it really is. You have to kind of prepare yourself for, managing that dynamic. I think the one advantage that I always think to myself that I have is that I came into this thinking like I don't mind being a commercial writer. I don't mind being a commercial screenwriter. I had done and I don't mean to disparage it, I'm just sort of self-deprecating. The precious, like, short story, novel writing, singular voice, like, to varying degrees of success. And then one day I woke up and I was like, I would like to collaborate with wildly talented people to bring mass, storytelling to life, like specific storytelling with mass appeal. Like that was just like, that was the sort of evolution for me as a writer, where I was like, that's something that I want. Like, I do not mind this idea of maybe working in the writer's room for a person of interest, which is a procedural, and every episode is going to have the same structure. The characters are going to experience very little growth, but they have some version of growth over like interminably over seasons. But it was just like I was ready for it because it was once I was behind the scenes, I was like, look at all of these craftspeople. These are some of the most talented craftspeople you could ever work with to bring this show to life that we all just take for granted. We just watch it and we're like, of course it looks this great. Like it's on TV. But then when you're behind the scenes, you're like, the talent is immense. So that to say, it's like I've always had this in my mind where it's like I don't mind the commercial nature of this because like if you can succeed, the trade-off is like, hey, I get to work with extraordinary talent and this is reaching an audience of millions, which is it's not out of I don't think it's out of ego. It's out of like what else do we have at the end of the day but human connection through, at least for me, storytelling through, that act of creating a narrative. That has always been the driving force for me. But in that world of like kind of post-network TV, streamers coming in, chasing after, kind of riskier sort of narrative, it's introduced this kind of exciting tension, but it's invited a lot of folks into the fold who are not from a traditional TV background. Like my wife, for example, started as a playwright. She came in to this business when there was just like a wave of playwrights coming into TV to work on some of that more elevated prestige content, which was very exciting. That's where we got a lot of probably the shows that we love the most. But when you talk to those writers, maybe, in between shows and things like that, there's a kind of a tension there. It's like, hey, I really want to do something that's, exciting and personal and highly specific. And I'm getting pushback from a studio, or executives at a studio, which represent a much bigger shareholder kind of apparatus. I think so. Therein lies as a big tension that a lot of people have to kind of navigate for themselves. It's like, how much are you willing to maybe have these principles as an artist? How much are you willing to make some concessions, some creative concessions for, the things that you want to work on in order to get, something on the air? We had something, my wife and I sold a show. We had it set up at a studio. It was probably, I would say it falls into this sort of like riskier bucket of what a narrative is for a TV show. And it was fascinating just to see how the executives were trying to navigate the thing that they bought. And it was just like as every experience is in Hollywood, every day there's always going to be something new to learn. This was like just a very eye-opening thing where you're like, oh, we told them exactly what this show was. We had a big star attached. Like this thing is going to help you guys more than you ever know. And they knew it. They
Can
were
you tell
like,
us which show this is?
um, this is actually now the show has become the movie that we're working on, this sort of dark comedy psychological thriller. It's called Sid. Um, and it was set up as a TV show and and that's a, that the life of that is a whole other conversation about, projects and the longevity of projects and how they live and die and survive. But, in this case, it was just really fascinating to see like we told them exactly what it was. They knew what it was. We had a big star who was like, I don't want really anything to change about this show because I don't want to do it otherwise. And then almost immediately the executives were like, well, what about this? And what about this? And this and this and this. And then it became this kind of dance where we're like, we're us as the writers, we're like, yeah, we can make concessions, but you realize like what you're doing. You're trying to turn it into something that will completely upend what the intent of this show is, and then we all lose. So I thought it was just a very good example that I certainly keep in mind of like, it's really it's like until you get it on the air, it is going to be a fight, and you're going to have to know kind of like what you believe in, what your red lines are. I mean, we basically we kind of broke up with them in the end. We took it away from them because we felt that they were completely trying to compromise like what that vision was. And we felt that it wasn't worth our time to try to redevelop it on their terms and just say thank you for working with us, but we're going to take this elsewhere.
And that was that because they were scared or because they didn't understand or because they're just always trying to maximize the commercial opportunity and that smooths off the edges.
Yeah, another wonderful, very, let's how long do we have? Yeah, it's like a combination. I mean, you have to like every Hollywood is just like it's glamorous, but it is so fear-based, right? Everyone is afraid. Like that's just what it is. I mean, everyone who's an artist understands that. We're driven, we have a certain passion, but a lot of it is also it's fear, which is good. You can capitalize on it or you can succumb to it. But Hollywood is a very sort of like fear-centric place, especially on the development side, because you have these executives who they have they have a budget, they have a mandate. They need to just fill the script, fill the order, so to speak. Some are really good at navigating that version of what their journey is, and others, maybe there's room for improvement. So really, I think in our case, it was we felt that we had their understanding and their backing and their support. So we went into this um, feeling quite empowered. I mean, we had an Oscar-winning A-list, actor attached. My wife, who had come off of, a very successful show, Swarm on Amazon. So I bring up those details because that usually forms a package in the mind of a studio that says, okay, these aren't just folks who are just starting out. We don't have to baby them through the process. These are people who have successfully navigated and achieved, and that affords you a little bit of like grace. In this case, I think it was like a fear on their part, which was driven by a lack of understanding of what we were really trying to do. And then this desire and then once you have those in place, then it was like a desire to like, oh, okay, well, let's conform this thing to the sort of programming that we already have here even though at this studio, like they were just still figuring out like what their identity was. So it was just sort of like a storm of like kind of asynchronicity around, like desire and intent and execution. It was, but which is kind of like a common a kind of a common tale these days in Hollywood, I would say.
Can you tell us a bit more about some of the misconceptions that people have about working in Hollywood in general and Hollywood screenwriting in particular? Particularly, of course, Hollywood has such an aura of glamour. So, how does it live up to that? How does it absolutely not?
Yes. No, of course. Well, we all get the glamour, which is great. I think that's something that's why we're fans of the movies and the TV and the culture of it and the celebrity of it, the gossip of it. I mean, that's all such like a natural sort of like, oh, of course. Something that I really appreciated and still hold true, which is this is a working class town. These are people who are wildly talented, are very passionate for all the reasons I think I just listed, the reasons like that we become an audience member. For them, it was the reason why they wanted to become a production designer, a music supervisor. Go through the credits and you will see hundreds of people there who never get enough credit for what they do, but they are instrumental in bringing this magical thing to life. And I think sort of the misconception is that it's like Hollywood especially. And look, I'm like a born and raised New Yorker, so I always had one kind of perception of what LA was. And I'm so grateful that I moved out here 10 years ago and, disabused myself of that, perception because, Los Angeles is the second biggest city in the United States. It's a really beautiful city, has its issues, but what city doesn't? And it's a wonderful, diverse place full of like incredibly, talented, hardworking people that just want to show up. They want to be compensated, properly for their work, go home, be with their families, be with their friends, their loved ones, and live their life. They want it to be a sustainable career. And I think that's just so important to keep in mind that, what we see, comes from people who just are so talented and so passionate and without the sort of what's the word, like the kind of the glamour of it, the sort of the gossip of it, there's a whole thing too, I think when a lot of people come out here and it's like, oh, it's all networking and everyone is just trying to sell themselves and everyone is fake and everyone is sinister and like, there's a lot of like negativity to what this space is. And I think in a great way. And this is a part of my philosophy just to like stay sane. But it's like that's just not true. I think if you lead with kindness and respect for people, and you show up at work and you believe in it, then that you just naturally gravitate towards others who do as well. And I believe that. I mean, I went from literally, again, I think about my own career. I knew no one. I started out as an art department PA, and then a few years later, I found myself working with two of the most successful directors in the world. And I don't think that came from like sinister manipulation and competing. I met all of those people to a degree. There's always one. I have this philosophy. There's always one. Everyone else is generally wonderful. And then there's always one who's going to represent that kind of culture.
I mean,
And
that's going to be one of my questions, right? But we can get to that.
yes, yes. But I would say, yes, that's a big part is that this is like a very three-dimensional town full of really like wonderful people who just want to show up, do the work, and make the magic. I mean, that is it. We are driven by that desire to like, show up and like entertain and be thought-provoking and all of it.
It's a really interesting characterization because I mean, that absolutely is not what people think. Yeah, I was saying what's the alternative version, and I was ready for you to say about the things that aren't glamorous, but we do not think of it as a working class town full of working people. We've had so many conversations as well. I told you that we had two unions speaking today, And this issue of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and the kind of labor exploitation of creatives. I think you're hinting there about these working conditions. We'll get to the kind of sinister stuff as well. But yeah, can you talk a bit more about what there's kind of a subtext to your points there as well, which is about these people just want a fair day's work, and that's can we talk about that precarity and that kind of labor exploitation and the difficulties there?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's just I should say yes, in my Hollywood is this, it's still also this. We
Yeah,
coexist.
yeah, yeah,
There's a cohabitation of the good and the bad here, and it's you want it to be so much more because we're so aware of it now, but we're all still dealing with structural and systemic forces that, are kind of keeping the little guy down. I experienced that firsthand, and came up PA. It's a it's an hourly wage, like I started out in New York. I moved to LA again, not knowing like really anyone. I had nothing. I had like achieved a certain kind of level, working for a couple seasons on Person of Interest, which, that was a total hustle. I had to make all these connections and this and that. And then I came out here and I couldn't get to that position that I was in New York because of just a few certain things that, would be kind of boring details to get into right now. But it was just like I had to kind of just start all over again. So what did I get? I got an office PA job on a Disney show that paid, it was minimum wage at the time. So I was like, great. Now I'm like, before I was a 30-year-old PA. Now I'm a 32-year-old PA, making even less than I was before. But again, I was still driven by like, what else am I going to do? I don't have someone who could walk me in. I had the fight, I had the desire, so I did it. But it was awful. It was like I was making like $10 an hour working for Disney. You're like Disney, like what's up, guy? You're I didn't even get, I didn't even get like a pass to go to Disneyland if you're working there. So it was one of these things where you're like, but I did it knowing that I was like, this is not permanent, but this is also awful. This is a grind. I had to, you scale back your entire life just to make it work. And which, look, that's part of what life is at times, making these necessary sacrifices. But at a certain point, I got up to a level, it's called script coordinator is the position. And that's sort of like an entry level position into becoming a staff writer. So historically, being a script coordinator or a writer's assistant, those were the stepping stones in order to get staffed on a show. So they talk about a mythology. The mythology of this business as a writer was you work your way up, writer's PA, script coordinator, writer's assistant, get a freelance episode, then you're going to get staffed. And that was what it was historically. But that script coordinator position, when I got it, was not covered by any union. So like you would just get thrown around, in terms of what you were getting compensated, and you're on call 24/7. It is a pretty it has a glamour to it, but it is a pretty rugged in the trenches kind of job because you can't live your life as long as you are in production. Like you are on call, like you can get a call at any time, and you're going to have to turn around that script. And it's so crazy to think, but the entire production process can bottleneck at the script coordinator, because they're waiting for you to. To kind of format, proofread, track continuity for this script so that when it goes out to several hundred people, it like everyone can really work off of it. So it's like a very high pressure, super detailed oriented position that was not covered by a union, and you're kind of getting squeezed, and it was awful. It was really just awful because you're like, not anyone can just do it, and one mistake, I've seen it can throw off a whole production where you're just like, and everyone in the production is like, what's going on with the writer's room? Why can't they get the scripts out properly? And it's bad for business. And then thank God a union finally came in and was like, okay, we're scooping up the script coordinator and the writer's assistant into this union to give you guys actual protections. And thank God that happened because then once I finally had those protections, there were instances where it got like you needed someone in the corner because like people you could just get exploited by well-intended people but who are also under pressure to get things done, and it's like it could be pretty nasty business. So that was a big actual kind of coup for those key positions to get that coverage, that union coverage. that fight is still happening. I think animation writers, as far as I know, they're not, they have some, and then please, you'll have to just look this up after. I know this is being recorded in perpetuity, where I'll probably get this wrong, but there is an issue with like writers for animation not being fully covered under the WGA, and it's still like a big issue. So there's still these positions that are kind of not covered, could lead to a high degree of exploitation. And that's not great because on the sort of mythical level of Hollywood is like we are in service of a higher power, a higher ideal. And that was always in conflict, at least for me, where I was like, we say we're doing all these great things, and yet you're like calling me at 3 in the morning to turn around a script that's going to take me 5 hours to do. So it's like, what kind of town are we? And I think that was always illustrative of that like cohabitation of like the good with the bad, I guess you could say.
We're going to have to go to the floor to questions from the chat in a minute, and I don't want to end on a really sad note. But I said I would ask you about the sinister stuff, so I will very quickly. And I'm not inviting you to put yourself in a libel situation or anything like that. But can you tell us about the yeah, I mean, sinister was your word, in terms of the exploitative, the way that the structures permit exploitation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah, I can. I mean, we all know it because it's out. Like the dirty laundry is out. It's been
Right, and
aired.
we're in the midst of the most horrific news story right now of, power and exploitation and so forth. Yeah, like yeah.
Very
But sorry,
much,
go
very
on.
much. Yeah, so we're seeing the absolute worst of it, in a way that thank God I never saw any of that. I mean, and that level. I'm sure maybe if I started in the 90s, it could have been, even in the early aughts. That's what's so scary to me as someone who came in during this sort of tectonic shift in the whole sort of business model of it, but also in the whole conceptual model of it. Like this, like you speak to folks who kind of came up at that time and yeah, there were some really awful things, and it depends who you're talking to. You're talking to an actor, you're talking to a writer. Those are folks who kind of, I think, have a high degree of exploitation by certain entities, production entities, producer entities, like that kind of thing. Um, that like it's unimaginable, and it scares everyone here too, as these things kind of are revealed. I mean, there's some folks who are like, well, I know the so and so was like that for a long time. I know a lot of that, unfortunately. More on the writer side, where it's like some writer is lauded for this show and has got very wealthy off of it and has all the accolades, and then it took me no time, and with respect to maybe the person I'm thinking of, to finally to meet so many people who circulated with that particular writer, for them to be like, that writer was awful in so many ways, right? I mean, eventually that writer kind of got his due to a certain degree, but it took years for it to come out, and it's still not the full story. So in a way, that's the quite sinister element. Then yes, there's the things that we thank God we know about now and are being exposed, and hopefully, justice will be brought, but then there's a lot of like what I kind of sort of mentioned coming up, where you meet, there's the sinister way that people want to be competitive with you, and in a way where you're like, hey, I'm not bringing that energy. Like, why are you coming after me? And everyone has a version of that, because it's like there's a way, because of this mythology of this business, oh, you just have to be for yourself. Like, everyone else is an impediment to your success. I don't believe that. And if you do believe that, it makes your life a lot more problematic, and it doesn't lead to anything good. And then there's like, up from that level of sinister stuff is what I kind of mentioned, of like the way that people in positions of power who are not so like glamorous per se would kind of exploit that power, punch down, be disrespectful, allied people from the legacy of what, of a particular show, like that kind of stuff, especially as a writer, where your whole existence is a kind of a credit. There's a way that some, showrunners are very quick to kind of remove you from the legacy of that credit. And that is also, to me, I mean, I'm thinking of one particular person who's he's a middle-aged man, father of two. He's still like haunted by a certain experience, and you're like, oh my God, this stuff is very real. And I mean, I'm haunted by all very, kind of various things as well. Where you're like, my God, like, did that really happen? From like sexual harassment to, these microaggressions from people who are like coming for you, and you're like, I just started here. Like, how you already are now determining that I'm some threat to you? It's just like that.
Mm.
That is another aspect of the navigation where you have to sort of be ready for being in this thing that is supposed to represent this ideal, and then on the ground, like I guess in anything else, the reality of really, how that ideal actually plays out.
Mm. I just want to invite you to kind of end. I mean, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it's I'm part of the problem by wanting to not end on a bleak note. But very quickly. I mean, you've had this overview of 15 years. Can we say anything positive about how the culture is changing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, very much. The culture is changing. Like you just like I think we have to kind of pump the brakes on like, I think probably a lot of us are like, well, we see the problem, why can't we fix it right now, right this second? I just think I wish that could be the case. Like, but the reality is you're dealing with different generations, different competing interests, different ideologies, different intentions. So this is just this wild laboratory of like fight. I think about this all the time, fighting for your narrative. I guess
Mm.
maybe I'm deluded, but I think my narrative is more sound than the narrative of previous generations, which in terms of this business and where I am, at my career and my age, I like to think like, hey, do I have an opportunity to represent a change in how this is done, especially in terms of like mentality, especially just in terms of like base level of like kindness and respect. Um, and in that respect, I think it is changing immensely. Like I think about, my relationship with my wife. We're in a interracial marriage. We're both creatives. My wife created a spectacular show called Swarm, which years ago would never have been made, but it got made. And that is like proof positive of some level of hope. I mean, yes, every day the narrative is mergers and YouTube is the actually number one biggest streaming channel out there. No one's watching anything anymore and this and that. And you're like, it's all very scary, rightfully so. But I think like anything else, if you believe in the enterprise, if you're passionate, if you want to stick it out, then the opportunity right now is that like you have more power than ever to change, what the future of this business will be. I truly
Well, that is a nice, hopeful note to end on. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes. I've been really cheeky and monopolized and not allowed enough time for the questions in the chat. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to tell you two of them at a time, in case that helps us get like address everybody's comments, but do it quickly. So James asks, is the Netflix Warner Brothers deal the beginning of the end of Hollywood? And Danielle asks, do you think the franchise model has changed how writers are valued? Are writers now um, architects of IP rather than authors of stories?
and I just went on my whole like the Hollywood is getting better. Then you asked the two questions where you're like, oh well, like maybe that's to everything that we're doing. Netflix, Warner, my God. I mean, you guys could read about it just like I can. Everyone every day is like edge of their seats, like what is this? What's the real intention behind it? I mean, Netflix on the one hand was a gift, and on the other hand has been a curse for, especially from like the creative point of view, with the kind of power that they have and the sort of growing monopoly that they have. So, I'm not a big I like the business side of things. It's not my focus. So like take this with a grain of salt. But, just in general, these mergers are going to happen. These are representing, I think, kind of what I see in my understanding of the history of Hollywood, just like common, but still very scary ways that these studios collapse and rebuild and collapse and rebuild and merge. And, now with the sort of the nature of storytelling change. And this is a whole other thing that we could probably talk about, but just like what is storytelling? How are we consuming stories? I mean, the questions, do we need TV shows? Do we need movies? Or can we survive on micro dramas, 1 minute episodes, across 80 episodes? I think that Netflix sort of Warner speaks to that kind of fear in general, and we're all sort of still waiting to see how it plays out. And then in terms of the question about, yes, writer versus architect of franchise IP, God, we're in that as well. It's, every studio, every risk-averse studio chasing IP, not a bad thing, but it's also, hey, like the original storytelling, is that still something that we want to do at the TV and film, like, filmmaking scale? I think so. And we see, I mean, Sinners not one of the biggest movies of the year, totally original. And that could also, spawn into a bigger IP as well, world building IP. But you're like, that it's, yeah, writers are literally navigating that at the moment. And again, I think the one thing I think about is like, I don't mind the sort of architect side of it because I guess I kind of eventually learned the mechanics of it. So I'm kind of excited. Like this unto itself is a craft. I think it's important to also sometimes just like remind yourself that there's like an idealized version of what a writer is, which is probably why a lot of us get into it. And then there's like the practical, everyday on the ground version of it. And I think that's an excellent question that really kind of speaks to, navigating those two realities, like writer
I
versus.
love how much you're using the word navigating since we called this that.
Oh yes, it's such a key word, really, truly.
I got two optimistic questions, and then we'll we'll draw it to a close. And one is, how can smaller organizations or social enterprises, do you know that terminology? Do you call them social enterprises? They're like small businesses for good with a social purpose.
Right.
Uh, so, how can smaller organizations or social enterprises use world building techniques to strengthen their brand storytelling even without blockbuster budgets? And has the WGA and other such unions been able to help the writers and other creative workers have better working conditions and better work-life balance? You described it being, hard to have to live a life alongside that kind of
Yeah.
role.
Yeah, okay. No, they're two wonderful questions. For social enterprises, yeah, of course. I think those tools are available to just about anyone, is what I've realized. Because, like, at the end of the day, ask yourself, think of a movie or a TV show that you love and ask yourself, why do you love it? And I think it probably comes down to a character that you really enjoyed spending time with, you know. Um, and if you are a social enterprise organization, I mean, it feels nice to think like, hey, how do we exist as a character in a world? And that is kind of a nice way to maybe start building a narrative, depending on what your intention is. I think that's just like, it feels like a good metaphor to get going. And if you're literally talking about how, like, we're a social enterprise organization, we're looking to produce content, I think that's a great place to start as well, because you have all the tools at your ready to like create your version of a narrative. And I know we didn't get into it at all, but that whole micro drama vertical series, that is now, I would recommend everyone just to start looking into it. I know it's very weighted towards romance content on a few select platforms like Real Short and Drama Box, but that whole thing is about to explode open in a way that I don't think we quite even understand yet. But to just kind of marry a couple things like the social enterprise world building question with a new format, hey, can we produce our own series? Do we have a budget to produce our own series to get our narrative out there in a compelling way, meeting people where they are in short form content? Um, and then the second question, the WGA and the other unions, yeah, they are fighting all the time as best as they can. They have blind spots for sure, but in a great way, like when I was the script coordinator, I was living proof of the success story of like a union, like kind of standing up for the little guy. The issue is because of all these mergers and the way that, taste is shifting, away from TV and film and onto other platforms and this and that. It's, there's probably a way that the unions and they are thinking about it, but need to be more agile, need to be more responsive in terms of like fighting for their creatives in an ever-changing kind of landscape.
There's one question that we don't have time for. Maybe we can do another thing another day, and it's the AI question. But that is too big for now, and I can see that I have taken terrible liberties, and we're now at 2 minutes past 6 here in the UK. 10, I think, for you. But I just need to draw your attention to the huge amount of love for Etan in the chat right now. Just a lot of people saying no, no question, but just wanted to say it was really interesting. Thank you so much. Really, absolutely riveting. Um, so interesting. Yeah, just everybody loves A10 and yeah, and for good reason. Thank you ever so much for your time and for bringing the online section of our festival to a close in this way. It's been really, really worthwhile. Everybody who's loving A10 in the chat, please fill in our feedback form and let us capture that because that helps us continue doing what we do. And for everybody based in Oxfordshire, we'll see you on campus, hopefully, for more events across the rest of the week. But yeah, thanks very much, Aitan, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, everyone. Really, thank you. It was such a pleasure.